Hello, everybody. Ryan here. We've got another bonus episode for you this week. Today we have on Alec Karakatsanis, a civil rights attorney and author, for an interview about their new work, Copaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. We highly recommend that you check them out and the amazing work that they've done, and of course, links to their work, including this one, will be in the show notes. As always, read good books, especially this one, organize yourself, and enjoy another bonus episode of The Socialist Shelf. Take it away, Lenore.
Hey everyone, Lenore here. Welcome back to the Socialist Shelf. Unfortunately, Jacob could not join us today. I am running the show, but I do say us because we have a guest. His name is Alec Karakatsanis. He is the executive director of Civil Rights Corps. He is a civil rights lawyer. He's done incredible, valuable work taking on the American money bail system, exposing the tactics that our carceral system, what he terms the punishment bureaucracy, uses to sell itself to the public. Alec, nice to meet you.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, thank you for coming on. Well, we are talking about one of your recent books today. You're the author of two books, of course. One is Usual Cruelty, the complicity of lawyers in the American injustice system. But your recent one, is the one we're talking about. It's called Copaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News, and that's a title and a definition in one. And I figured you started off at the early on in the book, but I figured we'd get you started on what got you down this road of investigating these tactics, how police and prisons are sold to us in the newspapers. I understand 2020 was what really kicked you off here.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been doing civil rights cases across the country for many, many years. I started my career as a public defender, and that was when I first really started to understand how the criminal punishment bureaucracy functions, and to really see up close on a daily basis in jails and prisons and courtrooms across the country, the gap between the stories that the system tells about itself and what it does and why, and what it actually does and how it kind of ruthlessly crushes the most vulnerable people in our society, and any organizing effort to be part of a social movement to change the way our society looks in any meaningful way. And so I got to see that up close. And then, over the last few years, been doing kind of systemic civil rights cases, and have been really alarmed by the way that even after we establish these horrific violations of people's basic rights, people are being thrown in jail cells, horrific conditions, because they can't afford to pay, small amount of cash, for example, or separated from their children because they're very, very poor, or all the incredible, discrimination against people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, immigrants, the treatment of people with disabilities, and all of these things that we're seeing. And then when we establish these things in court, the way that the system responds to sort of recreate a lot of the same injustices under new labels, and the way that the news media um, talks about that process, both about the original injustice and the harm that's happening, but then how it sort of secures buy-in for so-called reforms that don't fundamentally change the way these systems function among liberal, well-intentioned people, was what really got me personally feeling quite urgent about writing more in depth to help people see the mechanisms by which a lot of liberal institutions, like nonprofits, news industry outlets, even ones that you think of as liberal, universities and professors, et cetera, I became really interested in the particular propaganda stories that these institutions tell to get society constantly stuck in this cycle of highly profitable government repression, and obviously the parasitic corporate activity that is connected to it. um, and and in particular, just really interested in exploring like how so many people who actually want a world that looks pretty different, if you sort of ask them and talk to them about their values, like how are these people being brought along into this incredibly violent and unjust and unsafe project. And that's kind of what got me started, in particular after the 2020 uprisings.
No, for sure, and it is a perception game, absolutely. What you said toward the end jogged my memory a little bit. You mentioned studies in this book, of course, that contrast the perception of rising crime nationwide with with a perhaps a more nuanced view that people have of their own neighborhoods, their own localities. You know, the same people surveyed who may believe that we are in the middle of a nationwide crime wave. If you ask them about their own neighborhoods, um, they're more likely to say, "Well, it's safer. Well, it's safe around here." And it speaks to a real divorce between what's on the ground and what's reported in the news, in particular. You start off the book with a really incisive case study in what's called the family visit industry. And this is, listeners, whereby many U.S. jails end free in person visits from loved ones. They sign contracts with telecom companies, themselves owned by private equity firms. And then they turn around, they make these companies hundreds of millions of dollars from family separations, with sheriffs getting a cut of the profits. Right now, people have to pay to speak to their loved ones who are incarcerated over the phone. And in many cases, this also incentivizes keeping the prison population above a certain level to keep the market rich, to keep the contract lucrative. In the case of Genesee County, you point out, the sheriff of Genesee County took part in propaganda efforts during the 2020 uprisings. He marched with protesters to burnish the image of the police. And this culminates in 2024, right? He goes on to speak at the Democratic National Convention. You know, again, somebody who profits handsomely from the separation of disproportionately poor and black families, now saying we need to vote for Kamala Harris to stop fascism. And it's like you say, it highlights the important role that liberal politicians, public intellectuals, institutions play in legitimizing what you refer to as the punishment bureaucracy.
I think that the really important thing to understand is the key point you started with, which is the more news that people consume in the current environment, the less informed they become, or maybe more precisely, the more uninformed they become. This is a really profound truth that we have to examine. And one of the things I try to do in the book in really accessible ways with examples and sometimes jokes and stories is that I try to walk through how does this happen and why? What is the exact process through which, and by the way, this is a phenomenon that is particularly acute for liberals. So I talk a little bit about the French philosopher and law professor and Christian mystic and World War II resistance hero Jacques Ellul, who did a
Hmm.
study of propaganda from the first half of the 20th century across different societies: Nazi propaganda, Soviet propaganda, Chinese propaganda, uh, Western European propaganda, American corporate propaganda. And one of the, I think, important and amusing conclusions he made from the study is that what we would call liberals and liberal intellectuals from each of these societies are actually the most susceptible to propaganda. And that is, for three reasons that he gave, which kind of get at your question. One of them, first one, is that they consume the most news. They, in other words, their perceptions and views of the world are less and less based on their own daily interactions in their own communities, and more based on like what the Atlantic or the New York Times or whatever is telling them about the world, right?
Precisely.
So it's mediated through something else. The second thing is that they feel the need to have an opinion about everything, even things that they don't really know very deeply. And then the third thing is this sort of lack of hubris, right? They think they're smart enough to be impervious to propaganda.
Hmm.
That's a very, very, very powerful and dangerous thing, especially when combined with the other two. And so what that leads to is that the people who consider themselves the most avid consumers of mainstream news are often the most uninformed people in our society, or the most misinformed people in our society, because they're completely ignorant of and uninformed about some of the most consequential things that are going on in the world, because the mainstream news every day, out of the millions of things that happen in the world, it decides which 15 to 20 things it's going to tell people about. And obviously, then it decides who are the sources that are going to tell people about those things, and what language is going to be used, and what framing, and right. And so pretty soon you're getting a very narrow slice of the world, but you're also being told that you're seeing, quote unquote, all the news that's fit to print, right? And
Hmm.
if you've seen on a lot of these corporate websites, they'll say something like, what you need to know about Trump's tariffs, or everything you need to know about the conflict in Palestine, like as if like this the stuff that they're telling you is like the full context that you need to understand what's going on. And so over time, after being exposed to dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of these stories on a daily basis, and conceiving of the concept of being informed as basically consisting only of consuming that information, people become incredibly misinformed. And that's one concept. A second thing that's relating to your question that I think is really important to understand is what I call the selective curation of anecdote.
Hmm.
So, let's take an example. Like if you ask me to explain to some 10-year-old child who wants to become a basketball player, uh, tell this child about Michael Jordan. I could make a video of Michael Jordan's career, a montage, and I could just include though only every missed shot that Jordan had in his career. Just a video. It'd be like 9 hour long video of just miss after miss after miss after miss after miss. I show it to this kid who's never really watched the old NBA, and this kid might conclude, "Hey, Jordan is not a good shooter. He's not a good basketball player. How did this happen?" What I've done is I've used true facts, so like actual examples of Michael Jordan missing shots, to create the false impression that Jordan was not a good basketball player, not a good shooter. The essence of the best propaganda, and particularly the propaganda that's targeted at liberals and progressives, is using true facts to create false impressions and false understandings of intentions. So this is what the news media does, say, with shoplifting or carjacking or all crime in general, right? This is what the William Horton episode was, right? In the Bush Dukakis elections, famously, right?
Hmm.
The anecdotes that you select and curate, you can get people to think, for example, in a particular town that murder is up simply by publishing 4 times as many stories about murder, even in a year when murder is down. And so the reality that you can create from people um, is highly manipulable, and that's essentially one of the most important concepts to understand when understanding why are people so afraid of, let's say, the crimes that are the police associate with poor people, black people, immigrants, and strangers, when in our society by far the most interpersonal harm is being committed by people who know each other, is being committed by large corporations, by people in power in various ways, right? So, air pollution, to take one example, kills 100,000 people a year. Much of it is
Hmm.
criminal. Same with water pollution. So, that air pollution alone is 5 times the number of homicides. Wage
Wage theft,
theft by corporations. Yeah,
$137 million a day. Yeah.
absolutely. It's like that is like 5 times all of the property crime that police report combined. Just wage theft alone. I'm even getting into tax evasion, which is like 60 times that amount. So anyway, you get the point. I guess it's important to understand that like the sources of information that you consume that tell you about crime are going to shape kind of what you think about crime.
100%, 100%, which makes people who consume more news so susceptible to this because it's skewed in all these ways by powerful interests directing how the news is shaped, what's reported. Um, you really crystallize the point of all this in the three main roles of propaganda here in your introduction, right? To narrow our understanding of threat. You mentioned that most interpersonal harm is from people who know each other, not from strangers, immigrants, whatever bugbear. Manufacturing fear and promoting punishment as the solution. And of course, I believe in the same chapter you mentioned Willie Horton, right? You mentioned that the science is there. Right, the Kerner Commission of 1968, going way back to that, even at that time, even during the height of what we consider the civil rights movement, um, there was knowledge that okay, American crime is a result of inequality that demands massive social investment, and so you have to ask yourself, okay, well, why hasn't this taken place? Right? What are the priorities of the politicians, of the moneyed interests that that are hobbling this? And part of the way that they hobble this, of course, is you're absolutely right. They inundate us with stories of crime, of violence, of outliers in, for example, the Willie Horton case, right? One person is released on a prison furlough system where 99% of those under it are, released completely without problems, but they focus on the one thing that goes wrong, right? And that skews our perception of what needs to be done.
This is one of the main problems that is, I think, really obvious to most people, that you can't make good policy based on anecdote, but that people in power are very, very good at selecting anecdotes that play into preconceived notions, and indeed to using certain anecdotes to distract people from what the scientific evidence shows. But like the way crime coverage works in the United States is essentially like when a politician comes on and says, "Well, there's no problem with global warming because it's cold today," right?
Hmm.
That's basically what modern crime coverage in the news is, and it's no different from the William Horton episode. But one interesting thing about the William Horton episode is a lot of people associate the racist, um, anti-science William Horton advertisements with the Bush campaign, right? But
Hmm.
in fact, it was a newspaper, the Lawrence Eagle Tribune, which did hundreds of stories about it in a really fear-mongering kind of way that actually brought the issue to national attention. That's where Bush got it from, and and the Lawrence Eagle Tribune won the Pulitzer Prize for this
God.
reporting. So when we talk about the kind of the role of like liberal institutional media in this, don't forget that like the kind of anti it's sort of like a modern flat earther approach, right? Like these people are constantly suggesting that the solution to us being safe is more and more and more punishment and more and more and more investment in the punishment bureaucracy, um, even though the overwhelming scientific consensus is that the things that lead to interpersonal harm in our society are things like levels of inequality and poverty, access to healthcare, housing, early childhood education, levels of loneliness and isolation, levels of community connection, toxic masculinity, exposure to things like lead in children. I could go on and on, but they're not like is the prison furlough program releasing 12 people or 10 people, or um, is the sentence for this crime 14 years or 11 years, or is this prosecutor only prosecuting 58% of cases versus 62% for the non-progressive prosecutor, right? All these little tweaks that these news articles breathlessly talk about are conveying this flat earther notion that like little tweaks in policy of punishment are the things that determine levels of violence and harm in our society, and we know that's just not true. And side note, what we know from just like comparing different countries and comparing different US states is actually the more punitive societies actually have higher levels of violence. So, if anything, the correlation is in the other direction. But it's a really fascinating phenomenon when you consider just how divorced from reality most of this crime reporting is.
No, absolutely. It's the science. The science is absolutely there. Our carceral policies are in fact criminogenic because they lock people out. And Michelle Alexander goes over this extensively in New Jim Crow. They lock people who are charged with felonies in many cases through rushed and unfair plea deals, out of employment, out of housing, out of indeed there are many states where you lose your right to vote in perpetuity if you're a felon, and it locks people out of participation in this society that they would otherwise be able to affect in some way theoretically, right? And you get a little bit into that in how police mount crackdowns on movements for progressive reform. Um, what in particular, what struck me reading this book as well was the not just the how and the why, but the when of this coverage. In many cases, I'm thinking of during the 2022 midterms, you had this was actually a major plank in Eric Adams's strategy in the mayoral race for New York, right? You had his campaign people constantly talking about shootings. In contrast to in contrast to the actual level of violence that was going on. It was the same thing for, I believe, the shoplifting wave, which wasn't actually a shoplifting wave, but which was pushed in the media by major retailers and their representatives at the time that they were pushing for legislation to curtail online competitors and try and get people back into brick and mortar. So not only certainly do you have incentives for for the inertia of the carceral system itself, and the telecom companies profiting from it, as we mentioned. Whatever companies are involved in feeding, housing, in keeping people in line, surveilling them, but also just as a matter of policy, shaping people's perceptions of reality just to make a buck.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing that and look, I guess I should just say, the the book tries to make all these points, but to go a little deeper as well, and also to use stories and examples that give the reader ammunition, for lack of a better word, to start having some of these conversations with people in their own lives, because like the general points you're making now are absolutely correct, and I've been trying to make them for a long time, but I found it really hard to convince people that don't already agree with me, without really digging into some of these examples. And that's why I began the book with that example that you talked about earlier, and that you referenced again, with the like prison and jail telecom industry. And I really like the other example you're referencing with Eric Adams. When you look at the type of stories that are covered about safety, and the timing of them, um, they actually are not connected at all to things like actual changes in levels of interpersonal harm and crime. They're actually much more linked to political developments or corporate developments, like, for example, an election, or a town council voting on a new contract for a new surveillance system, or a telecom company contract, etc. Right? So
Exactly.
that's what's driving the appearance of these things in the news. But it really helps to show people in really granular detail, a story like, um, sheriffs getting rid of the ability of children to hug their parents because there's a contract with a telecom company that says we'll give you a kickback if you're able to increase our revenues, right? And then the theory being that if you stop people from visiting their loved ones for free, they're going to want to use expensive phone video calls more. And there's something really subversive about telling that story. Not only does it expose the sort of false story that we're told, that the decisions being made in the punishment bureaucracy are based on safety, and not, for example, based on control and profit, etc. But it says something really more fundamental to ordinary people, and it's like, if the system is making this kind of decision that the science shows is completely, you know, inconsistent with increased public safety. For, obviously, separating children from their parents actually is not a good public safety policy in the short, medium, or long term. If it's making that decision on the basis of like how to make more profit, how can we trust anything that these people are telling us? And how do we trust any of the things that they're saying in particular about our safety? And that's one of the reasons that I opened the book with that story, because I think it's profoundly subversive to understand. And then I think it's connected to another observation I want to make, which is another thing I try to like to tease apart in the book, is how do we become more critical consumers of news, so that we can, when we're reading any particular piece of news or looking at it, or listening to it, we can start asking ourselves questions like, who benefits from this being a story out of all the things that the news could be telling me about? And in particular, who benefits from the timing of this story? Um, who benefits from the sources that are quoted in it? Who benefits from these sources that are excluded, and the context that's provided, and the context that's excluded, from how the story is framed, from the words that are used?
Yeah, yeah, no, the critical reading that that you bring up as essential to resisting propaganda, no, absolutely, is once you start seeing news stories this way, particularly news stories about crime, you'll never unsee it, because then you're going through, you're looking at, okay, well, this story, and you have several examples in the book, of course. This story only quotes police or former police, whether or not it actually discloses that they are former police. This story is only quoting retailers about shoplifting. This, that, the other. It puts me in mind. It puts me in mind a little bit of way back in our Crucible episode. European witch hunts would tended to take place in confessionally contested areas between Protestant and Catholic, because the competing churches had to be seen to be doing something, right? Whence the whence the manipulation of these narratives for political ends.
Absolutely. The use of these narratives for political ends, it sounds like an obvious point, but it's so counter to what we're told about the purpose of news and what we're told about the purpose of the punishment bureaucracy. We're told that we're being given all the news that's fit to print. We're being told what's important for us to know, to live life. We're being told about the most important issues of our time. When in fact, there's this bustling world underneath everything that we see in the news, and that bustling world is a life or death battle, really, for how to shape people's hearts and minds. And there's a multi-billion-dollar policing public relations industry that I talk about in the book that I didn't even really appreciate before I started researching for the book. That I think is kind of something that lies underneath your question or your observation, right? So like take Los Angeles for example. There's 42 full-time public relations officers at the Los Angeles sheriffs alone.
Hmm.
I'm not even talking about the rest of the LA. So if you look at LAPD, it's another 25. So that's 67 in just the top two police departments. I'm not even counting dozens of other police departments there, the DA's office, the mayor's office, the police foundation, the private foundation, the police union, the not even to mention the corporate PR people. Anyway, you get the point.
Hmm.
So there's billions and billions of dollars being spent, not only to like, it's not some vague thing where they just like spend money and then magically the news changes. You need to understand the exact mechanisms. So how is it actually happening? So I try to talk in the book and really tell the story of like, how is it that the police literally are curating what you see in your nightly news? Like,
Hmm.
it's not just that they're telling reporters that someone was arrested. They're providing audio and video and charts and graphs and experts or so-called experts and people to interview and a web of connections, right? And so these processes are important to understand if we're going to think about ways to intervene in them.
Sometimes they're even writing, ghost writing these op-eds themselves. In the case of the Seattle Police Department that you bring up, no, absolutely, and even where it's not that brazen and direct, of course, um, as you say, it's difficult to really dig down and get the full picture of this. You can ask many city officials who nominally have oversight over um, police budgets, as you mentioned, and they couldn't even begin to tell you how much is going to police PR. The other big example, of course, that you put out, Laquan McDonald's shooting in Chicago in 2014. Of course, Chicago PD. Invested heavily in police PR. They go from 6 full-time PR employees to 25, and last year's budget, as you say, funded 55 full-time police PR employees. 55 people just to burnish the reputation of this police department that's under fire for misconduct. And you have to ask yourself, okay, well, why, how much poverty, how many people could we house with that kind of money? Right? It's this total usurpation by police of journalistic functions, to maintain their own inertia. That's quite apart from the colossal waste of money. It papers over enormous crime because, of course, as we also find out, police reported crime doesn't include violations of constitutional rights, doesn't include assaults and other crimes by police themselves.
That's such a great observation as well, right? Obviously, when we talk about so-called crime, we're talking only about the very narrow range of interpersonal harm that the police themselves choose to document.
Hmm.
So this, by and large, does not include the rape of people in prisons or jails, for example, by officers themselves, right? Which is a rampant problem in our society. Just to give one example, it also doesn't include all the drug crimes that are happening in, let's say, corporate boardrooms or wealthy universities or boarding schools, right? Because when although the police as a propaganda term want to refer to themselves as law enforcement, right, they're only choosing to enforce some laws against some people in some places some of the time for some reasons. And it's not like this kind of neutral thing where like a law is broken and it's automatically enforced. And then the same is true with the news media. they're not reporting all of the things that threaten our safety. They're only reporting some things that some people bring to them for some reasons. Right? And so understanding that phenomenon is a really critical piece of consuming this information in a more critical way. And then I also wanted to respond to the other part of your comment, which is it's not just, as you say, that the police that all of these people are burnishing the reputation of the police. They're doing much more fundamental things that I try to explore in different chapters of the book. One of them is they're literally changing our conception of safety. They're they're changing our conception of what's possible in terms of like interventions, right? Um, they are constraining with deep cynicism the types of solutions that people can even conceive of, and then they are in a very ideological way shaping how we think about the violence and harm that the punishment bureaucracy inflicts. So just to take one example, in the wake of the 2020 uprisings, the police had a huge public relations problem because there were tens of thousands of videos from thousands of cities across the country of rampant police brutality against protesters. Unprovoked, it was basically there were tens of thousands of federal and state crimes, felonies, on video of police committing them. And so the police had a big problem, same problem that they experienced, to a slightly lesser degree in the 2014 uprisings after Michael Brown's killing in Ferguson, where they were just like caught on video doing wild stuff with tanks and tasers and guns and batons. And there's videos from the 2020 uprisings of the NYPD trying to run people over, right? I mean, um, incredible stuff. And so what are they looking at what their public relations apparatus did and how institutions like the New York Times helped them with this is very instructive. So first, I'll just give one example. One thing they did was they created these so-called independent commissions to study uh, all the violations of basic morality and law that they committed. And institutions like the New York Times parroted their talking points by calling these commissions "quote unquote" independent. And often these so-called independent commissions were just stacked with former police officers,
Mhm.
or in some places, police industry officials, and et cetera, et cetera. So just to call them independent is itself, a really important propaganda tactic, right? Because if if the police themselves did like an internal report and concluded that they had done nothing wrong and what they needed was, more money, like people would be like, well, that's like the police themselves. Like people are going to trust that less. But if it seems like it's some kind of independent panel of experts that's like dispassionately and objectively looking at it, and those people conclude something, then it has more credibility with the public. So they did that, and then what did these commissions conclude? Magically, lo and behold, across the country, and how did the New York Times report it? Well, they concluded that there were a lot of quote unquote mistakes and mishaps and quote unquote lack of preparation, lack of training, lack of appropriate equipment and technology, right? So this is stunning, right? Um, because what we actually saw was very consistent police behavior uh, all over the country. The police were
Mhm.
doing the same types of things.
No, just for a local example, of course, cops here in the state of Georgia, on average, log about 90% higher 90% higher than average training hours. Just to give you perspective, whenever people say, "Well, we need more training, we need more training."
The police training industry is one of the biggest scandals and boondoggles in
Hmm.
modern American society, but we can get into that later.
Yeah.
So, where I was basically going with that is to say that the framing of the problem was that the solution needs more investment in police, better technology, more intelligence divisions, more training, more equipment, et cetera, et cetera. And this was framed as sort of the independent conclusions of experts, right?
Hmm.
And when this stuff was reported, what was omitted from this reporting was that, among many other things, is that you can go back over 100 years to incident after incident after incident of police infiltration and surveillance and brutality and crushing of every progressive social movement for the last 150 years. Women's suffrage or anti-war movements or civil rights movement, LGBTQ movements, um, you name it, um, indigenous people movements, and you can find the same reports by the same commissions after every, and they're always recommending more resources, more training, more, and it's a really different news article if you present it as these like, oh, this system is in good faith trying to figure out what it did wrong so it can do better the next time. But if you omit all that history, then you can get away with that maybe. But if you told the story differently and you said, you know what, these same people formed really similar commissions after many, many, many dozens of prior examples of this, and it never made the police less violent. It never affected the fact that they only target the poorest and most vulnerable people in our society and progressive social movements. In other words, this is exactly what police are trained to do. This is their function.
Mm.
So what we saw in 2020 is not some aberration or mistake or lack of preparation or lack of training. It is exactly what the U.S. Policing system and the punishment bureaucracy generally have been doing all along. That is, in fact, its purpose and its function. So these are two really different ways of reporting on these issues. And so the police public relations apparatus is incredibly effective and has a lot of really, really sophisticated crisis management um, and rapid response capabilities. And their goal in every one of these instances is to mobilize as quickly as possible to shape the narrative of what's happening and why, and all fundamentally to distract from the true purposes of what the punishment bureaucracy is doing.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And these narratives, as you say, they resonate throughout history and into the present day because, they unfortunately they tend to work, and you see it now in how not only how Donald Trump is talking about his federalization of the DC police, for example, and his sending the National Guard into LA for similar reasons. He's citing that crime is out of control. There's a spate of carjacking, there's a spate of violence that only armed agents of the state can suppress. And it's. I mean, I just saw a headline on CBS the other day that Donald Trump is threatening to crack down in Chicago and Baltimore to combat crime, which is again, it is taking at face value. It is these news institutions taking at face value these stated motives for these crackdowns, and of course, at the local level, this enables all kinds of police abuses, but it scales all the way up, certainly to more sweeping federal authoritarian crackdowns. And I wonder if you might not, as we draw to a close here, talk about how this has culminated in the current environment in DC, because I know you're based in that area, so you have that perspective.
Yeah, I think a lot of liberals are able to see some of these tactics when they appear in Fox News or other right wing media, and one of the goals of my writing in my book is to help people see that basically the the New York Times and the Atlantic and NPR and other institutions like that are basically accomplishing the same substance, but using slightly different propaganda tactics, different language, different framing, etc., that is designed to appeal to a different audience. Different propaganda, and the best propaganda knows its audience and uses different tactics depending on which audience you're talking to. So, for example, I've been encouraged that many liberals I've spoken to over the last few weeks, when the New York Times reports, uh, as it sort of as its role requires as a stenographer of state power, when it reports that Trump is sending the military into D.C. to fight crime, um, or is blowing up civilian boats in international waters without any process at all, and sort of doing a preemptive death penalty for nonviolent drug offenses, even on their own telling.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when Rubio or Trump says that this is in order to fight drug trafficking or something like that, um, the I have been encouraged that many liberals are bristling at that, and they're saying, "Well, wait a second, that's the stated intention of Trump or Rubio, right? But like, you shouldn't be reporting that they're doing this to fight crime, for example, in DC, um, because we all know that there's other motives going on here." And so by adopting the stated motive of Trump as his actual motive, you're actually assisting in his propaganda strategy by falsifying his intentions. And I go into the book, and this is one of the, I think, the most important, I don't have time to get into it here, but one of the most important parts of the book is I try to explain to people why over the last 100 years of mass propaganda, why falsifying the intentions of powerful people is so vital for them. Because it kind of um, renders people less able to predict their future behavior because they fundamentally don't understand what's motivating them. And it makes people less able to fight for change because they're confused about why things are happening in our society. But I think the critical point that I wanted to make here is this is absolutely no different from all of the examples I collect in the book of the Associated Press and NPR and the New York Times and the Washington Post and all these liberal outlets in their daily reporting on crime, where they say things like, you know, Alabama is passing new mandatory minimum drug possession laws to fight the war on drugs, or to reduce addiction, or New York is passing a new law to fight shoplifting, or New York or California is cracking down on encampments to fight homelessness, or any of these examples, right? Um, Suggesting that like the reason for harsher drug laws is a good faith desire to reduce levels of drug use in a society is like climate science denial. That is not why we have the war on drugs. Everybody knows that, and I sort of walk through in the book all the evidence about this. But like, you're falsifying the intention. There are a lot of reasons that we have harsh drug laws, and nobody who I know who works in the system, including all the people I've known who've worked in the punishment bureaucracy itself, prosecutors, probation officers, judges, police, nobody thinks it's actually reducing drug use. That would
Mm-hmm.
be ridiculous, because after trillions of dollars spent and hundreds of millions of life years lost and hundreds of thousands of people killed and billions of people surveilled and searched, and huge sections of Central and South America destroyed through chemical weapons, right? The war on drugs has resulted in way more overdose deaths now, way more accessibility of drugs that these drug warriors themselves feel are dangerous. Um, by any stretch of the imagination, what Nixon and his cronies said, that their real reason for the war on drugs had nothing to do with that, has been validated, because none of these people actually think that more investment in police, prosecutors, and prisons is the way that you would, if you wanted to actually reduce levels of dangerous drug use, is the way that you would do it. Anyway, but instead, all these headlines just assume that. And I could say the same thing for shoplifting, right? Or homelessness. Like, nobody actually thinks that the way to reduce homelessness in our society is through cages and handcuffs and guns. It just doesn't make any sense. That's just not the reason that problem exists. Um, and so, anyway, I digress, but I think the falsification of intentions is vital. And when the liberal news media does this on issue after issue after issue after issue after issue, it sows the seeds of this authoritarian moment that we're in, because
Mm-hmm.
people start to think, oh, these institutions are operating in good faith. The only solution that's possible, and the only one that all these smart people can possibly think of, is more authoritarian state repression. um, and then you have Trump. And you've also in the process created such fear over rising crime that even though crime is at historic lows, and crime in Washington D.C. was at historic lows last year and is down 26% so far this year, right? That people believe that it's up anyway, and that the only solution for that is more authoritarian intervention. And
Right.
it's all a very dangerous combination.
No, 100%, 100%. So you have to ask yourself, you're faced with these numbers that obviously contravene the idea that, yeah, crime is that A, crime is up at all, and B, that our punishment bureaucracy serves to reduce it. You have to ask yourself, okay, well, who benefits from this narrative, right? It's this idea that reasonable leaders have carefully weighed different options, have attempted progressive and more compassionate courses of action, and that these haven't worked. So that this repressive response is the only way. That's one of the biggest fantasies, absolutely, that Copaganda sells us. And it obfuscates the origin of these policies, which are, as we touched on earlier, the product of organized interests of moneyed, propertied classes asserting power. And I think the last thing I want to touch on here is how we can assert our own power as people, and that's what makes your final chapter here, resisting Copaganda, particularly important. Not only does it lay out, sort of summarize the things you should keep in mind when you're reading crime stories in our news, but also what you can do to involve yourself in the day to day of these things. You have a wonderful anecdote in here about your mother, who's retired, who's doing who does court watch programs and just monitors the proceedings of court and can serve as a watchdog. I'm thinking of my own parents when I read this. They're both retirees. What it really so I wonder if you could give a quick rundown, because what I think the whole enormity of this problem really inculcates is this idea that resistance is necessarily glamorous and dangerous and something huge. And certainly there are aspects of it that are, but there's any number of everyday actions that everyday people can take in lifting the veil from society's eyes. And I wonder if you might not delve into a little bit of that.
This is one of, I think, my favorite parts of the book, which is really just helping people to understand that resisting propaganda is something that you can't do alone. It's too pervasive. It's too all consuming. It's something that requires us to reach out to other people in our community and to do things together with other people, because we need other people to hold us accountable as critical thinkers, as people accountable to our own values. And so, and there's a wide range of things that people can do. It's not just, I mean, I think it's very important to read together and do book clubs, to learn together, to engage in mutual aid together, to court watch together, to um, there's so many ways to get involved in your local library and your local migrant mutual aid groups and in your local schools. There's a million ways to get involved, but in different people with different skills. If you're a coder or an artist or a teacher or a public defender or a journalist, or you're a city council person, or you're someone who works in home health care, or you're a public health worker and generally, like, I try to give examples in the last chapter of ways that sort of everybody can get involved, because this is an all hands on deck situation. But we have to think about building connections and relationships in civil society that over the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years, a lot of very powerful people in our society have benefited from destroying the things that connect us, because when people are isolated, they're much easier to control. And so the all of the recommendations in the last chapter, whether it's the recommendations I have around the arts, or the recommendations I have around court watch, they all are centered around finding a group of other people in your community who share some of your passions and interests, and just doing stuff with them. And and um and I think that's the if I had to pick a key theme from the last chapter of resisting propaganda, that would be it.
100%, 100%. No, and it drives very well with what we say on this show. Every episode in the at the top in the theme song, read good books and organize yourself. And now that you've read a good book in this one, I appreciate very much that it ends with that call to action. Alec, it's been a pleasure having you on. Once again, listeners, the book is Copaganda: How the Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. The author is Alec Karakatsanis. Definitely keep up with him. Keep up with his Substack. Alec, you're doing incredible work. I've followed you for a while. that police body cam study in particular, I'm glad that's getting more play. I was very happy to hear it on NPR. Just, you're doing good work, and to all our listeners out there, so can you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.